At the end of the day, it looked like Alabama had maybe 10 or 15 minutes of good basketball in them against Florida. At the beginning of the game, I tweeted a few times that the effort was awesome. The defense seemed to be there. Shots weren't falling, but everything else was there. The rebounding was good, the effort was good, and everybody seemed to be clicking on all cylinders. It's reported right before the game that Latrell Reitzel is going to play and is expected to be used, a decent bit, is kind of how Nate puts it. So he's the first person to check in. He gets in before the under 16 timeout. So it's like, oh, great. Latrell's in. We've got this guy back that we've been missing for the majority of the year. This is going to be awesome. Now Alabama just needs to put together some stops, put together some offense, hit some shots, and all will be good. Well, starting about the 10 to 8 minute under mark on the first half, you could start to tell that Alabama was a little late on a few rotations, not nearly to the level of the bad defense that we had seen in games past, but it definitely was starting to slack a little bit, and there had been some sloppy turnovers early in the game, and there had continued to be a few others. Grant Nelson seemed to be pushing it a little too much. I don't want to say trying too much, but definitely forcing everything too much. So it ends up getting to the point where you can definitely tell Alabama is kind of almost crossing the hill. Then just before the half, Florida goes on they hit a couple of shots. They end up getting a few dunks, get some steals and some runouts, and Alabama goes downhill, and it does not turn into the half you want. So you're curious when it comes out of half, how is Nate Oates going to do this? You can tell that the energy and effort was not what it was when it started the half, and they're starting to feel defeated. Early in the game, there was a lot of effort. There was diving on the floor. There's just a lot of people trying and putting in the effort that you may not have seen the same level of in the Tennessee game, but they're definitely doing that in this game. Then they come out of the half, and Florida immediately keeps ripping it open, and it just continues to get worse and worse and worse. And a few things became apparent. One, Alabama is exhausted. We mentioned it in the recap of the Tennessee game that Mark Sears and Aaron Estrada both seem to be feeling the fatigue that set in on Reitzel being out. They Over the course of the year, they had been used to playing somewhere in the 32 to 34 minute range, and now they're both playing in the 38 to 40 plus minute range, for example, in the overtime games, right? So, 40 Mark Sears plays 40 minutes against Ole Miss. They both play over 40 against Florida in game one. And all of these games they had without Reitzel, so they're being asked to shoulder a much larger load, right? Because they didn't have that additional ball handler. Davin Cosby has stepped up, but he's still not, the ball handler at the same level that Latritzl is, with the same level of experience. So we could start to see that in the Tennessee game. The Florida game, that happened and more, right? The legs on everyone felt tired. Grant Nelson was a step slow. Mark Sears, there were some shots that he ends up putting up in the, not mid-range, but a little bit further out that go off the front iron. His layups don't seem to have the same spin that they normally do. And quite frankly, we just were not hitting some pretty basic shots and could not buy a three to save our life. So, that's the big thing. These guys are exhausted. The other big thing is trying to figure out what Alabama can do when it comes to a very physical team. Part to do with these physical teams is that Alabama hasn't had Reitzel, so they haven't had this person that can space the floor quite at the same level as someone else. To not to mention that Cosby and Walters and Stevenson are all freshmen that are not built to play in the physicality. Diabate typically seems to do really good in the physicality. This was not his best game. I talked about how good he did in the Tennessee game, but a lot of that has to do with the fact that Alabama has not been able to do as well on offense when some of these teams get more physical with it. The big thing that tells me is just the team needs to reset. they need to refocus, and they need to think about what it takes to win games. Because right now, I think there was a lot of forcing. There was a lot of letdown post that Tennessee game. The Tennessee game, we knew was going to cause a little bit of a letdown. You knew that there was going to be some players that maybe thought they were doing one thing and, oh, we're going to win the SEC title. You lose that game, and then you go on the road against Florida, and the energy just isn't there. You just had game day. You just had a huge home game. You had a huge crowd, and all of a sudden it's taken out of you because of the loss. So it didn't surprise me that Alabama lost the game. The nature in which they lost it was a little surprising, but to me, the big thing is Alabama is completely exhausted and just needs a break. If Alabama can get a break and reset and refocus going into this Arkansas and the SEC tournament, it will be huge. Also, Alabama playing on Tuesday, then playing Saturday, they've already secured the double bye. If they can get they played Tuesday, their next game will be Saturday. They won't play again until Friday. So Alabama has a long time to rest, and that's going to be really, really good for the team because, like I said and like I've mentioned, they were exhausted. So I don't want to take too much away from this Florida game. Florida, to their credit, did a good job. Alabama turned the ball over 13 times. It honestly felt like more than that. It, at times, was substantially worse than that. Grant Nelson did not have the game he had the first time. We talked about how good he was in the first game, had one of his best games of his career at Alabama. He ends up with 12 points, 6 rebounds, but 5 turnovers, and he fouls out. So, he did get some ticky-tack fouls. Grant Nelson has had the susceptibility to how he gets called. Sometimes will dictate how he defends and how he can play. So it would be curious for me to see, if Grant Nelson, takes it to people and, forces them to make some calls that maybe they're not, because Grant Nelson does seem to be getting a little bit more of the ticky-tack, smaller, hand-check style fouls that, big men typically are not getting. So, this game really felt like Alabama couldn't buy a shot. Only 2 people hit a 3 in the whole game. Rylan Griffin goes 1 of 3. Mark Sears goes 4 of 6. Mark Sears ends up having a really good game. He has 33 points, but he has just 1 rebound and 2 turnovers. So by no means was Mark the reason you lost this game. Honestly, Mark's the reason you didn't lose it by 40. But, it still just didn't feel like Mark was playing at his peak. I think a lot of that had to do with being tired, so I don't take anything about off Mark on that one. Estrada had a really good game. He was able to do a little bit more down low. I think how Florida defends suits his style better. He goes 9 of 11 in game 1. Game 2, he goes 8 of 11. So I think that Aaron Estrada, how he plays against Florida and their style of defense, fits how he likes to play on offense. So for me, the big things are, Alabama Alabama tied Florida in rebounding. They did get more offensive rebounds than the number 3 offensive rebounding team in the country. But Alabama just missed shots. They went 21% from 3. They, like I said, they turned the ball over, and they just were not. They were a step slow on screens. Everything just seemed lethargic. So the big thing that we want to talk about in this game is just, at the end of the day, the team is in a spot that you did not think they would be. Coming into the season, expectations among reasonable fans were somewhere between 10-8 and 13-5. That is exactly where you're sitting as a fully reasonable likelihood. You're currently sitting at 12-5. You're 21-10, you're 20-10. You have a good chance against Arkansas, we'll talk about it in a second, to get to 21-10, 13-5 in the conference. 13-5 and 20-10, most people would have accepted coming into the season. You're going to be a top 5 seed in the NCAA tournament, and you're not worried about the bubble. You're not worried about, being on the 8-9 line, having to play a 1 in round 2. You're completely happy with where you're at. So I think that's the big thing. The big thing is this season is not a failure. The season has done exactly what you would have hoped. They had 3 assistants leave. They had an entire roster leave. You only had 3 guys back. And Alabama has exceeded expectations by the majority of fans. One of the guys, however, that was back and is back, we want to talk a little bit more about, is Rylan Griffin. Rylan Griffin had an injury that happened in this game, and I'm going to try to be sure to include information in the next piece of content that I put out, whether it be on Twitter, on Substack, or on YouTube. But I'm going to be sure to include what happened with the injury. So he does get injured in the Florida game. He can't put any weight on his leg. Some people were thinking the worst. What happened was it was a calf injury. They're taking an MRI. We should know more information soon, so I will include as soon as I find out what happened and how long he potentially will be out. So that's something we need to watch, especially with the limited front or backcourt depth that we have with Latrell. He only played 8 minutes in this game, so whether he's having on a minutes restriction, whether he just wasn't able to play, whatever the case, this is something we want to keep an eye on, because Latrell and Rylan both being out greatly diminishes your backcourt. If you can get them back, the backcourt goes up, the fatigue goes down, and the quality of play goes up with it.